make a presentation to us based on his terrific book with the strangest title you could ever imagine, Hitler in Los Angeles, How Jews Foiled Nazi Plots Against Hollywood and America. And believe it or not, you'll hear in just a few moments about how Nazis, real Nazis, infiltrated Los Angeles society. And it's my pleasure now to call on Stephen Ross, Professor of History at the University of Southern California, Director of the Kasdan Institute for the Study of the Jewish Role in American Life, the author of Hollywood Left and Right, and recipient of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences Film Scholars Award, also nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. He lives right here in Southern California. It's my great pleasure to call on Professor Stephen Ross. Stephen, please come up. Let's give him a nice warm welcome, everyone.
Thank you for having me here today. 81 years ago, on November 9th and November 10th, 1938, not just Nazis, citizens, ordinary citizens in Germany, Austria, the Sudetenland, went crazy. They started murdering and pillaging. And for 2 days, they did so, and by the time they were done, several hundred Jews were dead, 2,000 synagogues destroyed, 10,000 Jewish businesses burned down, and 30,000 people sent to concentration camps, where many of them died. But today, I don't want to tell you a story of tragedy. Instead, I want to tell you an uplifting story of resistance. Can we get the slides up? All right, if we can focus that maybe a little bit. This is a map of Los Angeles in the 1930s and 40s. You can't read it here very clearly. I have it in the front pages of my book. But if you can see the red, everything in red is either a Nazi or fascist organization. Everything in blue is Jewish. Can imagine what it looks like. Next. All right, the top image is, if you take a look at it, that's a celebration of Hitler's birthday. And where is it being celebrated? It's being celebrated on Figueroa and 15th Street in Deutsche Haus, 1935. Next slide, please. And here, at the bottom of the cover, is a picture of Broadway, 1935, downtown Broadway here. And imagine being a Jew walking down there in the middle of the 30s, and you see Nazi flags flying over. Next, please. The story I want to tell you tonight begins July 26th. I'm used to speaking for 50 minutes. That isn't going to happen tonight. So I'm going to have my watch on to make sure I don't go too long. All right. On July 26th, 1933, Nazis in Los Angeles, operating as the Friends of New Germany, held their first open meeting in which they attracted several hundred people. And they told their audience that they were going to save America from its two greatest threats, communists and Jews, who they agreed was one and the same. And at the end of that meeting, a reporter asked if they would pose. He took 5 brown shirts and asked if they would pose for a photograph, and they did. And the next day on the front page of most L.A. newspapers, you had the picture of these 5 brown shirts. Now, for ordinary Angelenos looking at this, they're probably thinking these people are either thugs or Keystone cops. But they were looking at the wrong people. Those weren't the ones you needed to be afraid of. The brown shirts were not the brains behind the Nazi movement. Next, please. The brains behind the Nazi movement, as Leon Lewis, the hero of my story, knew, and we'll come back to Lewis. Next slide. Captain Robert Pape, sent by Adolf Hitler to Los Angeles in March 1933 to organize Nazi parties all along the West Coast. The Nazi leaders all wear suits and ties. Next slide, please. You then have one more. Next slide. Right, Hans Winterhalter and Paul Themlitz, the minister of propaganda, and the number 2 Nazi in Los Angeles who ran the Aryan bookstore. They always wore suits and ties. And it was precisely their ordinariness and their seeming respectability that made them so dangerous. Next slide, please. Well, in that newspaper article, at the bottom of that newspaper article was a paragraph that was ignored by most Angelenos except for Leon Lewis. And in the bottom paragraph, it said that Nazis operating at the Alt-Heidelberg Inn, which was just west of downtown, were opening up the basement to the inn to any soldier, American or German, who needed a place to stay, who was homeless, needed food, clothing, shelter, hot bath. And all they had to do in return was to simply listen to the Minister of Propaganda, Hans Winterhalter, educate them on the new Germany and everything Hitler was doing. Well, Leon Lewis, the hero of my book, understood this was no offer of generosity, that the Nazis in L.A. were trying to build an army of brown shirts in the same way Hitler had built his army in Germany in the 1920s. And they were going to do it by attracting disgruntled war veterans, German and American. And they understood that L.A. and Southern California was veteran central for the United States of America. There were over 150,000 World War I veterans living in Southern California, over 150,000 German Americans living in LA County. And what the Nazis hoped was that they could cash in on the enormous anger of the veteran community in America. Why? Because in March 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt took over as president, the first act he and Congress passed was the Economy Act of 1933, which reduced military benefits for veterans from the $80 to $100 a month range down to a maximum of $20, and for many, nothing at all. War veterans were angry. Leon Lewis understood this anger. Who was Lewis? He was born in Wisconsin in the late 1880s to a German-Jewish family. He went to college at George Washington, got his law degree at Chicago, graduated University of Chicago in 1933, and instead of going into private practice, he decided to dedicate himself to Tikkun Olam, to heal the world. And he became the founding executive secretary of a new organization called the Anti-Defamation League. 2 years later, he assumed the position of the ADL's representative to the motion picture industry, and he started working with the moguls, monitoring Hollywood films for potentially anti-Semitic images. When World War I broke out, he enlisted as a private and wound up leaving as a major. But it was experienced during the war, and particularly afterwards, when he saw the poverty, the desperation, and also during a war when he realized that men would shoot other men simply because somebody called their commanding officer, said, "Kill that man, he is your enemy." And Lewis returned to America knowing, wait, if an American could be told to kill a German simply because he's a German, and a German could kill an American simply because he was an American, why wouldn't a Protestant kill a Jew, a Catholic, a black, or whatever? And Lewis decided he would devote himself to making sure this would not happen in America. He left Chicago for LA in the early 1930s, and at that point, he resigned from the ADL officially, but remained their representative, their Southern California representative. And he also continued working with the movie moguls, monitoring images for anti-Semitism. But once the Nazis held their first open meeting, he understood that something had to be done. And since Jewish leaders around the country were talking rather than acting, he decided to act. He was a member of the disabled veterans, and he went to Patriotic Hall, which is now, as you drive downtown from here, if you're on the 10, and you go right by Figueroa, you will see on your right side, Bob Hope Patriotic Hall, built in the 1926 to house veteran groups. And Lewis decided if the Germans wanted to recruit an army that would eventually be a Nazi army to overthrow the communists and Jews in America, he would give them the men that they wanted, only they would be working for him and not for the Nazis. His first recruit was Captain John Schmidt, German-born son of a German general. His brother was a high-ranking officer in the Bavarian army. Schmidt had been a German military cadet until the age of 16 when he came to America, enlisted in the army, fought with General Pershing in Mexico, and then fought against his own family in Germany during World War I. Lewis asked him and his wife Alice to join every Nazi and fascist group in Los Angeles and to try to rise to positions of power. Next slide. He also recruited Carl Sunderland and his wife Blanche. Next, please. He recruited Major C. Burt Allen. Next, please. And his only Jewish spy, who only worked for a very brief time, Colonel William Conley. And he recruited Conley for two reasons. One, because he didn't look Jewish, but more importantly, Conley was the national commander of the disabled American veterans and was touring the country denouncing the Roosevelt administration for its heartlessness to the veterans. Well, within several weeks of launching the spy operation, these four men were going to Alt-Heidelberg, meeting with the Nazi leaders, ingratiating themselves, and then they met Dietrich Gefgen. Dietrich Gefgen told them how he had fled Germany in the late 20s after being part of Hitler's original brown shirts in Munich because he shot a communist to death and threw acid in the face of a Jew. So he fled to America, wound up in San Francisco where he enrolled in the National Guard, and while in the National Guard he drew up a blueprint of the armory there. He drew up a blueprint that showed where all the ammunition was kept, where all the military weapons were kept, where the officers' quarters were, and where the enlisted men lived. He then went down to San Diego to work with the Nazis and the Silver Shirts, who were their American brethren in hate, who were buying guns, rifles, machine guns, heavy artillery from two corrupt Marines at the Naval Army Base in San Diego. And he explained to the four spies that he wanted them to get a blueprint of the L.A. Armory and to get him a machine gun. And when they asked him why, he said, "We are going to start an uprising in America. And on an appointed day, we, the Nazis, the Silver Shirts, the White Russians, and all the Gestapo on every German vessel that docked on the Pacific coast had a contingent of Gestapo on it. They would get off the boats. They would converge on the armories at the same minute, the same hour. They would burst into the armories with full weaponry. They would round up the soldiers and the officers, and they would offer them the following opportunity. Do you want to join us in saving America from communists and Jews? Those who agreed would be readily welcomed into their army. Those who disagreed would be shot on sight. Well, Leon Lewis was a lawyer, not a spy master. He never intended to keep a spy ring running. And so the first thing he did, next slide please, was go to Sheriff James Two Gun Davis, in his favorite picture here, known as Two Gun because he won the national pistol shooting contest several years in a row with his left hand and with his right hand. He was in the police chief's office for 2 minutes explaining what his spies had discovered when the chief said to him, "Forget it, you don't understand. Hitler's only doing what he needs to do to save Germany from the Jews. And that in our city, the real problem aren't the Nazis, the real problem are all those communists in Boyle Heights, the Jewish neighborhood." And he threw him out of his office. Next slide. He then went to see Sheriff Eugene Biscaluse, and it was the same story. Here's a photograph that Biscaluse sent to his good friend, Dr. George Gissling, who was the Nazi counsel to L.A. He wanted nothing to do with Lewis. And so Lewis finally went to the FBI, and they were sympathetic, but they said to him, "We can't do anything until we are ordered by J. Edgar Hoover." and Hoover had no desire to help the Jews. No order was given. Leon Lewis was facing a dilemma. He had been funding the spy operation out of his own pocket. He had run out of money. He had lost every single client he had. They all wrote him saying, "Leon, we love you, but you're paying no attention to our business." And he wrote a memo saying, "I have 2 small children, I have a wife, I can't keep doing this. I either have to get funds or I have to shut it down." Next slide, please. So he went to 3 people he had worked with for years. The first, Irving Thalberg, known as the Boy Wonder, the #2 man at MGM Studios. Next slide, please. Rabbi Edgar Magnin from Wilshire Boulevard Temple, and Mendel Silverberg. I'm just curious, is there anyone in the room here who knows the name Mendel Silverberg? Not too many. How many of you have heard the name Lew Wasserman? All right, imagine Lew Wasserman on steroids. That's Mendel Silverberg, the most powerful entertainment attorney in America. He represented most of the studios. He represented the motion picture producers and distributors. He represented most of the studio heads privately and most of the Jewish actors in town. And on top of that, he was considered one of the 5 Republican kingmakers. That is, he was one of the 5 people who went into that smoke-filled room at the GOP convention to decide who the next presidential nominee would be. Lewis explained what was going on, and Silverberg said, "Don't worry." Silverberg then made a phone call to the 40 most powerful men, and they were all men at that time in Hollywood, and told them, on March 13th, 1934, I want you to show up at Hillcrest Country Club. Ask no questions, just show up. Next slide. When they arrived, they were escorted into a private dining room, and in front of every seat was a copy of the Silver Ranger magazine, which was put out by the anti-Semitic Silver Shirts. And as they thumbed through the magazine, they saw pictures like this. Next, please. And caricatures like this. By the way, both of these were made into stickers, and they would put on buildings and telephone poles throughout Los Angeles. Leon Lewis had worked with these men since 1913, and he understood that they were hard-scrabble Eastern European Jews, most of them, and they weren't going to give him money just because he was a Jew. And so he decided he would frighten them into generosity. And he explained that his spies had discovered that in their studios, in their blue-collar positions, below the line as it's called in the industry, Christian foremen had been firing every Jewish blue-collar worker. He turned to Louis B. Mayer and said, "Louis, MGM has only 1 Jew working in the studio lots. Harry Cohn, Columbia, you have none. Paramount, you have none." And he said, "But worse yet, my spies have uncovered hit lists, and your names are on those lists." The end of the evening, he walked out with the equivalent of $420,000 in pledges and a promise to keep funding his spy operation until it was no longer needed. And it's a good thing they did, because Lewis ran his spy operation from 1933 until the end of World War II, not till Pearl Harbor, but till 1945. And during that time, he foiled a series of plots to drive through Boyle Heights, machine gunning as many Jews to death as possible, to create phony fumigation companies that would pump cyanide into the homes of Jews, to blow up military installations along the Pacific coast, and to sabotage L.A. aircraft factories. And Los Angeles at that time was the largest producer of aircraft in the United States. But I briefly want to talk to you about 2 of the most nefarious plots he foiled. Next, please. One was using his new undercover operative, because he had 3 of those 4 men testify at a trial to try to bring national attention to what the Nazis were doing. But no one in America cared. He then recruited Chuck Slocum, who had been born in Oakland, raised in Long Beach, and Slocum had joined the Long Beach Ku Klux Klan in the early 30s because he was an ardent anti-communist. But he soon discovered that the Klan didn't just hate communists, they hated Jews, they hated blacks, and they hated Catholics. He didn't hate anyone except for communists, and he didn't think every commie was a Jew and every Jew was a commie, and he wound up working for Leon Lewis. And Lewis had asked him not only to stay in the Klan, but to try to rise up as far as he could. And he rose up to become the chief recruiter for the Ku Klux Klan for Southern California, and he was their point person for every Nazi and fascist group in the region. Next, please. He foiled a series of plots, one involved with Ingram Hughes, and in this proclamation, which Ingram Hughes had slipped in to every Sunday L.A. Times in the fall of 1935, in that proclamation, there's a line there that said, "I call on all true Christians to join me in enacting," and this is a literal quote, "the final solution to the Jewish problem that cannot be obtained through legislative methods alone." In the book, I talk about the plot, but suffice to say, his plot was going to be to kidnap 20 major Jews, including Busby Berkeley, and to hang them. And while they were dangling, dying on the rope, he was going to have machine guns and machine gun their bodies until the trunk fell to the floor. He was going to call the press the next morning, and he believed that bloodbaths would ensue. The plot was foiled. Next, please. Slocum foiled that one, but 2 years later, he foiled an even more dangerous plot. In this one, we have Captain Leopold McLaughlin, who's in the front row, the very tall man in the light suit. And if he looks tall, he is. He's 6'8". He is one of the 7 McLaughlin brothers, the most famous being Victor, who won the Oscar in 1935 for The Informer. And in his plot, he was going to blow up the homes of 24 major Hollywood figures, 22 Jews, including people like Harry Cohn, Louis B. Mayer, and 2 actors who were known to be too friendly to Jews, James Cagney, who spoke fluent Yiddish, in case you didn't know it, and Charlie Chaplin, who always said, "I considered myself Jewish," but he wasn't. And in his plot, he was going to blow up these 24 homes, and he promised that after blowing up those homes, it would lead to a bloodbath throughout America. Next slide. Let's just go 2 more. One more. One more. Okay, he was eventually brought to trial. Leon Lewis played the long game. He never told the authorities, even though the authorities knew there was a murder plot. They only brought him on extortion charges because Lewis also said, "You have policemen and sheriff's deputies who are involved in this plot as well." The judge found him guilty of extortion, sentenced him to 5 years in prison, but said, "If you take the next boat out of L.A., I will suspend the sentence." Victor McLaughlin, who thought his brother was crazy, ran out of the courthouse, bought a one-way ticket to Liverpool, and McLaughlin was never seen again. Next, please. The story ends really with Pearl Harbor. I mean, the book goes to 1945, but the bulk of the story ends there. On December 8th, the day after Pearl Harbor, the FBI, in a truly amazing form, rounded up several hundred suspected Nazis and fascists in LA, German, Italian, American, Japanese. And it was incredibly impressive, except for one problem. When I asked for the Freedom of Information Act of Hermann Schwinn, who you see here, Hermann Schwinn was the head of the Bund in LA. He was the Gauleiter, that is the leader of all German operations in the western part of America, and he was the #2 Nazi in the United States. His FBI file began in 1942. So if the FBI didn't have any information on him until 1942, how did they know who to arrest? And the answer is Leon Lewis and his assistant Joe Roos, starting on September 1st, 1939, started putting together lists of all the people they had spied on, all the Nazis and fascists, and they divided that list into 3 categories: highly dangerous, dangerous, keep under surveillance. And every year they updated that list. They sent it to Army intelligence Navy intelligence, and the FBI. And on December 7th, what the FBI did is they typed up, because I went to the National Archives to make sure I was right on this, and I found the document. They had taken Leon Lewis's lists, they had retyped them in their toto, and instead of calling it most dangerous, and keep under surveillance, they called it Group A, B, and C. All those people were rounded up. The FBI got the credit, but Leon Lewis understood that as long as you're willing to let other people take the credit, you can do anything. And so, what is the take-home for all of this? Without ever picking up a gun or weapon, they used, Leon Lewis and the courageous group of men and women who worked for him, used the most powerful weapon of all, their brain. And even though every one of his undercover operatives, save one, was a Christian, they never thought they were fighting for the Jews. What they believed is that when a foreign power comes to this country and recruits Americans to go out and kill other Americans, it was up to every American to protect every other American, regardless of their religion, their race, their ethnicity. That this is what it meant to be a true American. And I want to end by quoting Leon Lewis, who right after the war was over, wrote a memo talking about what to look ahead now that victory was achieved. And he wrote, "Only in a truly tolerant and accepting America can we achieve the true realization of the American democratic ideal." Thank you.
That was really outstanding, and I want to thank Dr. Ross, Professor Ross, for that insightful presentation. Stuff I did not know. The book is entitled Hitler in Los Angeles. Absolutely fascinating. Can't put it down reading, so I strongly recommend you get a copy.